When I was a child around the age of 8, I experienced a night that I will never forget. My parents had children quite late, and so my two older siblings were at least 10 years older than me. That night, I was awakened by a loud noise coming from downstairs. My parents were arguing about something, but I couldn't understand what it was. Curious, I opened the door a crack and heard my mother talking in a panic, seemingly worried about something serious. I stood on the stairs, looked down from above, and called out loudly, "Mom, Dad, what's wrong?" My mother rushed to the bottom of the stairs and said urgently, "Go back to bed right now." I quietly obeyed without asking any more questions. Although I was still wondering, I tried to close my eyes and go back to bed. Not long after, I heard the front door downstairs slam shut, and then everything went completely silent. I assumed that my parents had left the house, but I had no idea why. I continued sleeping. A little while later, I was awakened by strange noises from downstairs. This time, it was the front door opening, followed by footsteps but no talking. I naturally assumed that my parents had come home and tried to keep quiet so as not to wake me. I heard sporadic footsteps, light bumping from downstairs, cabinets and drawers being opened and closed, and I even thought I heard the refrigerator opening. At the time, I thought it was my older brother Chris, who was 10 years older than me. At that time, he had a driver's license and often came home late. It was normal for him to come home at 2 a.m. and rummage through the refrigerator. I told myself that was a reasonable explanation for the noises I was hearing. But then, I began to hear footsteps coming up the stairs. The footsteps grew louder and closer until they stopped right in front of my door. The door opened slowly, and I lay still, eyes wide open, staring at the door. There was no light outside. Someone was moving in the darkness, and all I could see was a blurry black figure that looked like a head. I called out softly, "Chris, is that you?" "Mom, Dad." There was no answer. I continued to ask, "Who is it?" The person still did not answer, just gently closed the door. I lay still on the bed, feeling both confused and scared. The footsteps sounded again, this time coming down the stairs. I convinced myself that it was my dad coming home to check if I was asleep, but I still couldn't understand why he was so quiet. A moment later, there was no more noise from downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go downstairs to see what was going on. I turned off all the lights and quietly walked down the stairs. When I got close to the kitchen, I stopped right at the door. In front of me was a tall figure standing in the middle of the kitchen. I thought to myself, that could be Dad, and called out softly, "Dad?" A deep voice replied, "Go back to your room now." I was so scared that I ran upstairs into my room, closed the door, and immediately got under the covers. My mind was confused as to why Dad's voice was so different. I lay there shivering and trying not to think about what had just happened, until I heard the front door open again and my parents' voices coming from downstairs. I immediately ran to the stairs and saw my parents standing there, their eyes filled with worry when they saw me awake. I asked what was going on, and they just said that Chris was in a bit of trouble, but would be fine. It wasn't until months later that I learned that Chris had been in a car accident that night, driving while intoxicated. My parents had gotten a call from the hospital and rushed there, leaving me home alone without locking the door. When I told them who had come into my room and stood in the kitchen, they were horrified. My mother started yelling at my father for forgetting to lock the door. And then my father started searching the house with a gun in his hand, while my mother called the police. Eventually, the police came and asked me what had happened. I only remember telling the story to a police officer, and my parents were embarrassed to admit that they had left me home alone without locking the door. Luckily, nothing seemed to have been stolen, but it was clear that the intruder had no intention of harming me. Just thinking about having a stranger in the house was a terrifying experience, let alone having to go through it at the age of 8. Around 2013 or 2014, when I was a kid, my family moved to a new house for the convenience of studying and to save money. The house was quite nice, with a cozy fireplace for the winter. My little brother was about 7 or 8 years old at the time, and he was crazy about Batman and had a favorite Batman car. He used to play with that car all day long. One afternoon, when my brother ran into the house from the backyard, he said he had just found something. Mom and I asked him curiously, and he showed us an old photo of a boy, the kind that schools take pictures of students. The photo was old, covered in dust, and so blurry that the year it was taken was unclear. We thought someone must have lost this photo and that there was nothing to worry about. But then my brother pointed to the photo and said, "This is Buddy, my friend." Both Mom and I were very surprised. My brother had few friends, and Buddy had never been mentioned before we moved here. I shrugged, thinking that maybe he had met someone new at the neighbor's house. But it wasn't that simple. That night around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my brother talking. Annoyed, I went into his room to remind him to go to bed, lest I wake my parents. When I walked in, I saw my brother sitting up straight in bed, as if he were actually talking to someone. I told him to go to sleep, and then went back to bed. A few days later, my mother asked me if I'd seen my brother up at night. I said no, other than hearing him talking the night before. My mother said my brother had been acting strange lately, but then we all assumed that was just how kids do it. One night, as I lay in bed, facing the door, I heard a noise that startled me. It was my brother's Batman car making noises. I got up and went into my brother's room to tell him to stop playing at night. But when I walked in, I saw him sleeping soundly on the bed, and the car was on the floor, making its own noise. I turned it off and went back to bed, trying to sleep. In the following days, my brother kept talking about Buddy. This started to worry me. I tried going to the neighbors' houses to see if there were any children that my brother could befriend. One house had no children, and the other was empty. At this point, I started to feel uneasy. My dad thought that maybe Buddy was just my brother's imaginary friend. But almost every night, one of us, Mom, Dad, sister, or me, heard my brother's Batman car making noises and had to go in and turn it off. One night, my sister and I decided to sleep together to calm down because we were both scared. While we were talking, suddenly the sound of my brother's car rang out again. They both looked out into the hallway and saw the Batman car rolling through the door without anyone pushing it. They both screamed and ran into my parents' room. My parents thought my brother was playing a prank, but what he said next sent shivers down our spines. It wasn't me. Buddy wanted to play. After that, my parents threw the Batman car away, even taking out the battery. Everything seemed to be okay, but the next day my brother got the car again. My parents asked him where he got it, and he said, "Buddy gave it to me." The car was completely destroyed and thrown away for the last time. Although my brother was upset, my parents bought him another Batman toy. Everything seemed to be over until a week later. One afternoon, my mother was cooking on the George Foreman grill in the kitchen. She came out to the living room to ask us a few questions, and then suddenly the whole family heard a loud bang in the kitchen. When we went to check, we found the grill lying in the middle of the floor, as if someone had thrown it. My mother swore it had never been near the edge of the stove. My father couldn't explain it either. Nothing strange happened after that, and we moved a year later. But to this day, I still wonder if my brother's imaginary Buddy was really just an imaginary friend. When I was 10 years old, my family moved to a new house in a different town. I started a new elementary school and entered 5th grade. Starting a new school was really hard. I was a strange kid, trying to fit in with friends who already knew each other. At the new school, students had to eat lunch with their classmates, and this made me feel quite out of place in the beginning. Kids that age are often judgmental, and I was seen as the strange new kid, which made making friends even harder. But during those difficult early days, I met a few neighbors, including Dan. Dan went to a private school, so we didn't go to the same school. We met while I was riding my bike down the street, and he asked me if I had just moved to the house around the corner. From there, we started hanging out. A few days later, I met Alex. Alex came to my house and rang the doorbell, asking my parents if I was home. I was surprised when my parents called me out to meet him. Alex said he lived down the street and asked if I liked playing video games. Of course, I said yes, and he invited me over to play Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. I really wanted the game but didn't have it yet, so I agreed. We went to Alex's house, and I immediately felt that his house didn't look as nice as the other houses in the neighborhood. It was the same size, but it looked old and unkept. There was no grass in the front yard, just 2 large dirt patches and a walkway across the street. When I entered the house, things were even worse, with things lying around. Alex led me down to the basement, where it smelled like there were a dozen cats living there, but strangely, there were no cats. The basement was the messiest place in the house. We sat on a brown leather sofa in front of the TV. Alex had both a GameCube and a PS2, and we played San Andreas in two-player mode. While we were playing, I thought I might like Alex and maybe want to be friends with him. After 2 hours of playing, I wanted to go home. Alex looked disappointed that I wanted to go home. He even followed me a long way before I said goodbye, implying that he should go home. This was the first sign that Alex was not normal, but I wasn't too worried yet. The next day, Alex came to my house again and asked my parents if I could come over. This time we played GameCube in my room for about an hour. I didn't want to say it, but I started to dislike Alex because he made me feel uncomfortable around him. The next day, Alex came over again, but I didn't want to see him, so I told my mom that I wasn't feeling well. That night, I rode my bike to Dan's house to ask him out. When we were cycling past Alex's house, he suddenly ran out as if he had been waiting for me. This made me feel strange and a little awkward because I had said I was sick. I told Dan about Alex and felt that he was a little strange. Dan was surprised that I had been hanging out with Alex and said that his whole family was weird. From then on, I decided to stay away from Alex. But that weekend, Alex came to my house again, and my mother told him that I was not home. That night, I woke up and found my bedroom window open, even though I was sure it had been closed. The cold wind from outside made me shiver, and then I felt something touching my leg. I panicked when I saw Alex standing at the end of my bed. He told me to be quiet because his parents were arguing, and he wanted to sleep with me. I yelled at him to get out. Alex begged me to let him stay, but I firmly threw him out of the house. The image of him climbing out the window and disappearing into the night was really scary. The next morning, my parents went to talk to Alex's parents, but things didn't go well. Alex's mother laughed and yelled at my parents, not taking responsibility for her son's actions. My parents didn't want to call the police because Alex was just a kid, but a few nights later, I heard a knock on the window again. I knew for sure it was Alex, but I didn't answer. The knocking lasted for 5 minutes, and I even heard him trying to open the window. I was really scared, but my parents just told me to ignore it. A few days later, Dan and I went biking around the neighborhood with another friend. When we passed Alex's house, I saw him running to the window and staring at us. That night, I was woken up by the sound of broken glass. I screamed when I saw Alex climbing out my window. I ran into my parents' room in a panic and woke them up. When my dad went out, Alex ran home. My dad chased after him and went to Alex's house, banging on the door and demanding to talk. I don't know what my dad said, but Alex's parents eventually agreed to pay for the window to be fixed to avoid calling the police. I never heard from Alex again, although I saw him a few times before the family moved away. But what haunts me most is Alex's true intentions that night. What did he want to do to me? Surely if I didn't react in time, he could have done something terrible.